So what you just saw was aerial footage of Ho Chi Minh City, formerly known as Saigon. So after the war in Vietnam, they renamed the city from Saigon to Ho Chi Minh City to pay tribute to the communist revolutionary leader, Mr. Ho Chi Minh. Of all the countries I'm going to be visiting this year, Vietnam was definitely at the top of my list. I had just heard so many incredible reviews about this country, and people could not stop raving about how affordable it was to live here. But what I was most interested in learning about was the Vietnam War. You see, I'm Canadian, and we didn't really talk about the Vietnam War in history class growing up. We discussed World War I and World War II, and the horrible things that we did to the First Nations that founded our country, but never really touch on Vietnam. The story behind the Vietnam War is super confusing, so I took it upon myself to condense it and break it down to as simple as I possibly could for all of you guys. Okay, here we go. Let's get started.
Wow! Yeah! What is it good for?
Absolutely not!
Say it again, y'all. Wow! Good God, y'all! What is it good for?
I find it good for absolutely nil!
So Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia. From 1859 to 1862, France took over Vietnam for its exports of rice and rubber. France also took over Cambodia and Laos and colonized them all together to make French Indochina. Worst name ever. Then Nazi Germany took control over Vietnam in World War II. But once they lost the war in 1945, France tried to regain control over its former territories. During World War II, Ho Chi Minh started to create an army called the Viet Minh to fight the French rulers. In 1946, war broke out between the Viet Minh and the French army. Now enter the US of A. America's president at the time, Harry S. Truman, decided to help out France. At the time, the US was involved in another war called the Cold War with communist countries China and the Soviet Union. Ho Chi Minh was determined to turn Vietnam into a communist state. Now this worried President Truman, as he thought if Vietnam became communist, then the rest of Asia would too. They called this theory the domino theory. To help the French win the war against Vietnam, the US gave them money. But even with the United States' financial support, the Viet Minh still won the war in the north of Vietnam. In 1954, Vietnam and France signed a treaty called the Geneva Peace Accord. This treaty was made to split up Vietnam between the communist north and the anti-communist south. In 1957, the North Vietnamese began guerrilla warfare against the South to turn them into a fully communist country. But the USA supported the South with money and advisors. On August 2nd, 1964, North Vietnamese boats attacked an American ship called the USS Maddox, patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin. After this attack, President Lyndon Johnson got Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This resolution allowed the US to use military force in Vietnam. At first, they started with just bombing, but by the end of 1965, there were 184,000 US troops fighting in Vietnam, and over 500,000 by the end of 1968. The whole world thought that the Americans would easily win the war. Their army was way more advanced and included a navy and an air force. You need to think, this is the American army versus a small, poor country in Southeast Asia. Most of the war was fought in Vietnam's dense jungle. Now, Americans just weren't trained to fight in these conditions. It was something they were totally not used to. Now, this is the part of the story where it really starts to get confusing. So a lot of people living in the South weren't a big fan of their government at the time, so they would switch sides and they would support the communist North and join the Viet Cong while they're still in the South. The Viet Cong in the South fought a guerrilla war. No worries if you have no clue what a guerrilla war is. Here's the definition. Guerrilla warfare is a form of irregular warfare in which a small army used military tactics including ambushes, sabotage, raids, petty warfare, hit-and-run tactics, and mobility to fight a larger and less mobile army. They would take these little bands of soldiers and stage ambushes and built massive underground tunnels known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail to hide and protect themselves. Very sneaky, but highly effective. The Viet Cong would stage suicide bombings and sneak attacks on the Americans in the South. The whole idea of this war was incredibly unpopular in the USA. People had no clue why tens of thousands of Americans had to die to protect a little country on the other side of the world. Television, newspaper, and magazines broadcasted innocent Vietnamese civilians killed by American bombs and a highly toxic chemical compound called Agent Orange. There was a lot of protesting against the war, not just in America, but around the entire world. Finally, President Johnson stopped sending more American troops. He even refused to return for another term as president because of what happened with the war. Then this moron, Richard Nixon, was elected in 1968 and promised to end the war with honor. But he actually didn't make any peace until 1973, 5 long years later. The fighting finally stopped April 30th, 1975. After close to 20 years of war, at least 1.2 million North and South Vietnamese civilians were dead, and 58,000 Americans died in the conflict. Once the American army lost the war, the North Vietnamese invaded the South and unified the country under communist rule. Today, Vietnam is mainly communist in its government. And oddly enough, the US and Vietnam are cool with each other. So basically that massive domino effect theory that they thought was going to happen and the entire reason this whole war started actually didn't mean anything, and the country still became communist and everything was totally fine. You want to know the really crazy part though? So remember at the beginning of the story when I talked about the North Vietnamese attacking the USS Maddox ship and basically sparking this like powder keg and allowing the US to invade Vietnam? So in 2005, a publication was finally released that stated the USS Maddox wasn't even attacked. It was literally just a made-up excuse by the US government so that they can attack Vietnam. So after the Vietnam War was over, Cambodia went through a very, very tragic genocide. And when I was in Cambodia a couple weeks ago, I covered the story. It's definitely not one of my normal vlogs, but I thought it would be important to bring it up because it was definitely a very important part of history that was totally missed. If you haven't checked it out already, here's a link to it. Now, the whole reason I decided to do this vlog today, and I also decided to do the Cambodian genocide vlog, is based solely off of this quote. Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it. I'm Canadian, and if I wasn't taught about the Vietnam War, there has to be hundreds of countries out there that have no clue what happened. So this is why I feel the need to make these types of videos, because I want to educate you guys on what happened in history, so that it hopefully is never ever repeated again in the future. Thank you so much for watching today's vlog. I know it definitely wasn't like my normal positive ones, but I do feel it's important to educate you guys on this subject. I love each and every single one of you. Stay focused, my friends. Please like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications to receive a brand new video every single day.